Everybody wants to know what happened in China from 1839 to 1911, but not many actually know what happened. Here's the real story. Trade frictions grew with the European powers, especially Britain. British merchants had long sought to right trade imbalances with China. The Chinese had little need for anything more than silver from the West, selling porcelain, silk, and tea in return. Eventually, the British began illegally importing Indian opium into China, with the help of corrupt Chinese middlemen in specially designated coastal trade zones. When the Qing government moved to halt the illegal trade by burning confiscated opium, British traders petitioned their governments for redress. British gunboats fired on Chinese positions along the coast, outgunning the crude Qing cannon. The result of this so-called Opium War, which lasted from 1839 to 1842, was humiliation for the Qing government and a series of unequal treaties, including the Treaty of Nanjing that ceded the port of Hong Kong to the British in 1842. While foreign influence began to grow on Chinese soil, internal pressures mounted, finally erupting in the devastating Taiping Rebellion that raged from early 1850s until 1864, leaving an estimated 30 million dead in its wake. The rebellion began in the southern province of Jiangxi and was led by a visionary of Hakka ethnicity named Han Xichang. After failing at the local civil service examinations, Hong studied with foreign missionaries. He had a vision that pronounced him the younger brother of Jesus Christ, who was sent to earth to create a kingdom of great peace. Disenchanted peasants of several southern ethnic groups pledged themselves to his cause, giving up their property, which was then fairly redistributed, as well as opium, tobacco, alcoholic beverages, gambling, prostitution, polygamy, and foot binding. Men and women were equal in the movement, and soldiers lived in a communal lifestyle. It is interesting that the grandfathers of several of their later communist revolutionaries of the early 20th century were Taiping rebels. As the movement grew in force, it swept through southern China and later took the southern capital of Nanjing. The rebellion was weakened by contradictions among the Taiping leadership. Qing government forces, now partially westernized in military hardware and tactics, although still behind Japan, finally put down the rebels with the help of European soldiers. By the end of the 19th century, it was becoming clear to many in China that serious changes must be made in order to save Chinese sovereignty in the face of aggressive European, and eventually Japanese, imperialists. Although a self-strengthening movement had some success in military reform, the reforms were hindered by weak imperial leadership. By the end of the 1890s, the imperial throne was under the influence of a foreigner commune known as the Empress Dowager Cixi. In response to foreign naval threats, she squandered funds on a large naval pleasure boat, now a tourist attraction at the Summer Palace in Beijing. After losing the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, fought over control of Korea, it became clear to all that Chinese power was little more than a shadow of the past. Reformers, including Kang Youwei, finally convinced the imperial government to institute experimental reforms of government and military in the spirit of the reforms that had all too clearly yielded results in the Meiji reformation of Japan. The 100 Days of Reform, named for how long the reform lasted, were too much of a threat to the conservative imperial order, and its leaders were either beheaded or fled to Japan. Things soon went from bad to worse. Another massive uprising, caused by famine and unstable social conditions, erupted in Shandong in northern China. This movement was led by the so-called Righteous Order of Harmonious Raised Fists, Boxers for short. The Boxers, who included demobilized soldiers, went on an anti-foreign rampage in 1898. A number of foreigners were killed, and armies of 7 European countries and the United States fought off Boxer attacks throughout northern China. In the melee, the imperial library was looted, and huge amounts of treasure and antiques were taken from China by foreigners, who eventually demanded indemnities for their losses. More pressure was brought to bear on Chinese territory, and a fierce battle between Russia and Japan, which won, was fought on 1904 to 1905 for territories in northeast China. By 1905, the imperial system was in a state of near collapse. The civil service examinations were abolished in that year. Reform and revolutionary movements were rising both within and outside of China, with many young revolutionaries under the influence of ideas they had learned in Japan and the West. Among these was Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who helped organize the revolutionaries that eventually ignited a rebellion in the city of Wuhan in the Yangtze Valley. Although Sun was outside China at the time, he soon returned and was elected as president of the newly declared Republic of China, a modern-style, Western-inspired government that was supported by a variety of social classes that all wished to see the king come to an end. Within a month, however, Sun stepped aside and Yuan Shikai, head of Beijing military, was elected as president. The new government was unable to take control of the whole country, and local military governors began assembling their own spheres of influence.